Hey, before we begin, if you find yourself drifting off to this one, that means we're doing something right. Take a moment to like the video if you enjoy this kind of calm historical storytelling, and subscribe if you want more, only if it genuinely resonates with you. And drop a comment letting us know where you heard about this video, a friend, a recommendation, a late night rabbit hole. We love knowing how you found your way here. Now, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's go back. A long way back, imagine going into labor 1,000 years ago. Not the modern kind, where a hospital is a phone call away, where the lights are bright and steady and someone in scrubs appears almost immediately with something for the pain. Not the kind where a machine quietly monitors the heartbeat of the child inside you, where a team of specialists stands ready should anything go wrong, where the whole enormous apparatus of modern medicine positions itself between you and the worst possible outcome. Imagine, instead, a night in the year 1050. The house around you is built from stone and timber, the walls exhaling the accumulated cold of a northern winter. The fire in the hearth has been built up high, deliberately, because the room must be kept warm, warmer than it has been in months. Every gap in the shutters stuffed with cloth to keep out the drafts. The windows darkened against the night air that everyone in the room believes will harm you. The air inside is thick with wood smoke, and the faint, green, sharp scent of herbs being crushed and steeped in a small pot near the fire. The only light comes from that fire, and from 2 or 3 tallow candles, their flames steady in the sealed warmth of the room. You are not alone. You are surrounded by women. Your mother, if she is living. Your neighbors, the women of the village who have done this themselves, who have sat in the same heat, in the same dim light, and come through the other side. And there is one woman who moves with a different kind of purpose than the rest, who speaks quietly and watches you with careful eyes, who has brought with her a bundle of things she keeps always prepared for nights like this one. Her instruments, her dried herbs, her small supply of oils, and the knowledge she has carried for 30 years in her hands and her memory. She is the midwife, and tonight, she is the most important person in your world. This is not a horror story, exactly. It is something more complicated than that. For the women of the medieval world, childbirth was not an aberration or a crisis. It was simply a part of life, as expected, as recurring, as central to the rhythm of female existence as anything else they would ever do. Most women survived it. Most babies were born alive. The midwife knew what she was doing, and the herbs and prayers and accumulated wisdom of generations were not nothing. But it was also one of the most dangerous moments a woman could ever face. And tonight, quietly, with time to spare and nowhere to be, we are going to spend some time understanding exactly what that danger looked like and what remarkable women made of it. There is something almost disorienting about thinking carefully about medieval pregnancy, because so much of what surrounded it was so different from anything in our modern experience. And yet the fundamental human experience at the center of it, the hope, the fear, the bodily strangeness of growing another person inside you, was entirely and recognizably the same. A woman living in medieval Europe would typically have first realized she was pregnant not through any test or examination, but through the gradual accumulation of physical signs, the cessation of her monthly cycle, a change in how her body felt in the mornings, a particular tenderness, a particular exhaustion. The medical understanding of what was happening inside her was framed almost entirely through humoral theory, the ancient system of thought developed by Hippocrates and Galen and elaborated across centuries of Islamic and European scholarship into a comprehensive map of the human body. In this framework, the body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each associated with qualities of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. Health was balance. Illness was imbalance. And pregnancy was understood as a natural state, but one in which the body was particularly delicate, particularly susceptible to disruption. The medieval woman's body was already viewed, within this framework, as fundamentally cooler and wetter than a man's. That coolness and wetness was what made her body capable of carrying a child, a warm, growing, demanding presence that consumed significant quantities of the mother's vital heat and nourishment. During pregnancy, she was told, her humoral balance was more fragile than usual, and everything she did and ate and experienced could affect the outcome. What this produced, across the medieval world and across centuries of medical writing, was an elaborate system of dietary advice and behavioral restriction that we might find strange, but that was internally consistent and driven by genuine concern. A physician writing in the 13th century advised pregnant women to eat warming foods, roasted meats, spiced wine, cooked grains, stewed legumes. These were hot and dry in their humoral character, and they counteracted the cooling effects of the pregnancy on the mother's body. Cold and wet foods, raw fruit, certain fish, cucumbers, lettuce, were often cautioned against, not from arbitrary superstition, but because, within the humoral system, they would add cold and wet qualities to a body already struggling to maintain enough warmth to nourish the developing child. Michele Savonarola, a 15th century Italian physician, went so far as to advise pregnant women to avoid fruit almost entirely, arguing that the most noble and beautiful fruit in the world was the child she was already carrying in her womb. The implication being that no peach or plum was worth the risk. Water itself was often considered suspect for pregnant women. Wine, diluted and warmed, was frequently recommended instead, not as indulgence but as genuinely believed to be safer, because wine was hot and its warming properties would support the pregnancy in ways that cold water could not. This seems alarming now, and it is alarming. But it is worth understanding it as the product of a coherent theoretical system, not of carelessness or ignorance. Beyond diet, the medieval pregnant woman navigated an entire ecosystem of folk belief, superstition, and practical wisdom that existed alongside and often intertwined with the learned medical tradition. A 15th century French text preserves a remarkable collection of advice offered by the women of the village to one another, and some of it is vivid enough to stop you mid-sentence. Do not eat a hare's head, because your child will be born with a split lip. Do not let anyone throw cherries or strawberries or red wine in the face of a pregnant woman, or the baby will be born with a birthmark. Do not talk to a pregnant woman about any food she cannot immediately obtain. If she craves it and cannot have it, the yearning itself might mark the child. Give pregnant women the food they want. God and reason both forbid doing otherwise. These beliefs existed alongside genuine medical advice, not as its opposite, but as its complement. And what they shared with the formal medical system was their deeper purpose, to give pregnant women something to do, some measure of agency in the face of a biological process that was largely beyond their control. The restrictions and the rituals and the prayers and the carefully prepared meals were all, in their different ways, attempts to act, to do something in the face of uncertainty. Alongside the dietary restrictions and the folk beliefs, there were practical, sensible recommendations that have stood the test of time. Avoid heavy lifting. Rest when you are tired. Do not ride horses over rough ground. Stay warm. Keep away from sick people. Bathe regularly, but not in water that is too cold. Breathe clean air. Move gently. These were not radical departures from what we would advise today. They were the distillation of generations of observation about what helped and what harmed women carrying children. And through all of it, prayer. In the medieval world, the physical and the spiritual were not separate categories. The body and the soul were inseparably intertwined, and anything that threatened the body also threatened the soul. A woman carrying a child prayed constantly, not as a supplement to the practical measures she was taking, but as one of the most important things she could do, an act of real meaning in a world where meaning and matter were understood as continuous with each other. No figure was more central to medieval pregnancy and childbirth than the midwife. And to understand the medieval midwife properly, you have to be willing to set aside the caricature that sometimes appears in popular accounts. The vague, superstitious old woman at the edge of the village, operating by guesswork and luck. The reality was considerably more interesting than that, Midwifery in the medieval world was one of the very few areas of medical practice in which women had significant and largely unchallenged authority. The birthing chamber was a female space. The tradition of excluding men from it was so strong that a 15th century document from Belgium records the case of a man who was fined 15 livres for hiding behind a staircase to eavesdrop on his wife in labor. The fine was not symbolic. It reflected a genuine social and legal understanding that childbirth was women's territory, in a way that almost nothing else in medieval life was. The midwife was, almost always, an experienced woman herself, someone who had given birth, who had attended many births, and who had spent years absorbing the accumulated knowledge of the women before her. Her training was not formal in the university sense. There were no degrees in midwifery, no licensing examinations until the middle of the 15th century in some German cities. What she had instead was something arguably more valuable, a deep practical education, acquired through watching and assisting, and gradually taking on more responsibility, built up over years of presence in the rooms where babies were born and where things sometimes went wrong. Her knowledge was extensive and genuinely impressive. She knew the herbal remedies that could ease labor. Pennyroyal and ergot in carefully controlled doses could stimulate contractions. Raspberry leaf had been used for centuries to tone the uterine muscles. Fennel and chamomile could ease pain and calm a frightened woman's body. She knew how to assess the position of a baby in the womb through careful palpation, pressing her experienced hands against the swollen belly and reading what she found there. She knew how to turn a baby that was presenting in the wrong position, a skill that required both knowledge and physical courage, and that could genuinely save lives when performed with confidence and care. The Trutula, a compendium of women's medicine produced in Salerno in the 11th and 12th centuries, and one of the most important medical texts of the Middle Ages, codified much of this knowledge in written form. It described in careful detail how to handle difficult presentations, how to manage a retained placenta, how to support the mother through the physical ordeal of labor. Alongside it, and before it, was a long tradition of knowledge, transmitted not through writing, but through presence and practice, from experienced women to those who were learning, across generations and across the whole of Europe. The midwife was typically among the most respected women in her community. In towns, she was sometimes compensated by the municipal government with a pension or a tax exemption in recognition of the service she provided. Her reputation was everything. Women chose their midwife with care, because the woman who attended your labor might be the woman who made the difference between life and death, and everyone in the community knew that. A 1312 record from Bruges shows the town compensating 2 midwives called out to examine a newborn infant, found abandoned outside the city walls on Christmas Eve. Evidence that the midwife's expertise extended beyond the birthing room into the legal and social domain as well. She was also required, beginning in the 14th century, to take an oath before the church, swearing that she would not use the materials of birth, the umbilical cord, the placenta, for purposes of witchcraft, and that she would baptize any infant who appeared to be dying before she could get it to a priest. This last requirement reflects the urgency that the medieval church placed on baptism, and the practical acknowledgement that the midwife was often the only person available to perform it in time. Weeks before a woman was expected to give birth, the practical preparations began. For women of the noble class, this involved a formal ceremony and a ritual withdrawal from the world, the lying in, or taking her chamber. The rooms would be prepared with particular care, the windows hung with tapestries to block light and cold, the floors strewn with fresh rushes, the bed made up with the best linens. An elaborate service was held in which the church would pray for a safe delivery, and the woman would be blessed before she retreated into her private space. She would not emerge again until after the birth, and until she had undergone the ceremony of churching, her ritual return to public life. For women of lesser means, the preparations were simpler, but no less deliberate. The birthing stool was made ready, a low, curved seat designed to support the laboring woman in a semi-upright position, with an open center to allow the midwife access to the birth. Water was set to heat over the fire. Clean cloths and swaddling bands were laid out in readiness. The herbs were prepared, tisanes of raspberry and chamomile and lavender to ease the labor, poultices of warm herbs to be laid against the lower back and abdomen for comfort. Oil was warmed, ready to be used to ease the passage of the baby and to prevent tearing. And then there was waiting. In the days and sometimes weeks before labor began, the women of the household would be gathering, because birth was not a solitary event in the medieval world. It was a community occasion, attended by every woman who could come, the mothers, female kin, the neighbors, the friends of long standing who had been present at other births and who understood what their presence meant. The birthing room was warm and dark, and crowded with women in a way that served a function beyond simple support. It created a circle of witness, a human presence that held the laboring woman within it. That said, with its collective warmth, that she was not alone in this. Men did not belong in this room. There are occasional records of male physicians being called in extremis, when something had gone very wrong, and the midwife determined that a physician's skills, however theoretically derived, might help. But under ordinary circumstances, the birth was entirely female in its attendance and its atmosphere. The world outside, the world of commerce and law and theology, the world that men largely controlled, stopped at the threshold. This was a different kind of territory. When labor began, the woman was typically helped to walk or move, because movement was understood to help the labor progress. The midwife would assess the situation regularly, checking the position of the baby, monitoring the mother's state, deciding when to administer which remedies. The birthing stool brought the woman into a semi-upright or squatting position that used the pull of gravity as an ally, that opened the pelvis more effectively than lying flat on a bed. We know from modern obstetrics that this was actually correct. Upright positions do generally facilitate labor, do tend to shorten its duration, do reduce certain types of complication. The medieval midwife arrived at this knowledge, not through clinical trials, but through the accumulated testimony of hundreds of labors attended over many years. The pain was managed with whatever the knowledge of the time could offer. Warm herbal drinks, infusions of chamomile and fennel, sometimes preparations from plants with genuinely analgesic properties, were given throughout the labor. Warm compresses were applied to the lower back and abdomen. Aromatic oils were burned in the room. Prayer was offered continuously, not as a substitute for the practical care, but alongside it, interwoven with it, because in the medieval understanding of reality, the spiritual and the physical were parts of a single fabric, and attending to one was not separable from attending to the other. There was no anesthesia. There was nothing that could take away the pain of a prolonged labor in the way that modern epidurals and opioid analgesics can. What there was instead was presence, the hands of experienced women, the reassurance of a knowledgeable midwife who had seen this before and survived it, the prayers ascending toward a God who was understood to hold both the mother and the child in attention. That is not nothing. In fact, modern research on the management of pain in childbirth has shown that continuous, supportive presence from a knowledgeable attendant can reduce the perception of pain significantly, can reduce the duration of labor, can reduce the likelihood of interventions. The medieval birthing room, crowded and warm and full of experienced women, was doing something real. But real did not mean safe. And now we arrive at the darkest section of this story, the part that the medieval women who entered their lying-in rooms knew and did not quite allow themselves to think about directly, the shadow that lay beneath every birth. The complications of childbirth were the same in the medieval world as they are today, because they are biological realities, not subject to historical variation. The difference was in what could be done about them, which in many cases was very little, or nothing at all. The most common and most feared was obstructed labor, labor that did not progress, where the baby could not pass through the birth canal regardless of the mother's effort and the midwife's skill. This could happen for many reasons. The baby's head too large relative to the mother's pelvis, a malpresentation such as a transverse or breech position, a mother weakened by previous labors or illness, or malnutrition. Without the option of a surgical delivery, obstructed labor in the medieval world was a slow catastrophe. The mother labored on, exhausting herself, while the baby remained unmoved. Hours became a day. The midwife attempted every technique she knew, changing the mother's position, attempting to manually turn the baby, administering preparations meant to stimulate contractions. In some cases, these interventions worked. In many cases, they did not. Archaeological evidence from medieval burial sites tells part of this story. At St. Nicholas Shambles, a medieval cemetery in London, the skeleton of a woman was excavated with her infant still lodged within the birth canal. Unmistakable evidence of a death from obstructed labor. In Irish medieval cemeteries, researchers have identified 30 burials in which an adult woman was associated with one or more infants in positions suggesting they died together in childbirth. 2 breech presentations have been identified among these skeletons, positioned as the bodies lay, testament to the specific configuration of disaster that brought these women to their end. Hemorrhage, severe, uncontrolled bleeding was another of the great killers. It could occur during labor itself if the placenta separated too early from the wall of the uterus. It could occur immediately after delivery when the uterus failed to contract properly following the birth. In modern obstetric care, postpartum hemorrhage is managed with oxytocin and other drugs that cause the uterus to contract, with transfusions of blood and blood products, with surgical techniques. In the medieval world, the midwife had only what her knowledge and her hands could provide: manual massage of the abdomen to encourage the uterus to contract, herbal preparations believed to have similar effects, and the application of warmth. Some of these interventions were genuinely helpful. None of them could stop a major hemorrhage. When bleeding was severe enough, the outcome was beyond any intervention available. And then there was infection, the invisible danger that medical theory could not yet explain, because the germ theory of disease was still 6 centuries in the future. We now know that infections of the uterus and surrounding tissues can follow childbirth under any conditions, and that they were particularly likely in circumstances where the labor was prolonged, where the membranes had been ruptured for a long time, or where internal examinations had been performed with hands that had not been washed. Streptococcal bacteria can cause a systemic infection, what later centuries would call puerperal fever or childbed fever. That begins with a high fever, severe abdominal pain, and rigors, progressing rapidly to septicemia and death within days. It is important to note that this devastating epidemic form of childbed fever was actually far more common in the 17th, 19th centuries, when women began giving birth in hospitals, where physicians moved directly from performing autopsies to attending deliveries. In the medieval period, when women typically gave birth at home attended by midwives who had not been handling cadavers, the infection rate may actually have been somewhat lower than in the hospital wards of later centuries. But infection was still a real danger, still present in the medieval birthing room, still capable of claiming a life that had survived the labor itself in the days and weeks that followed. Breech presentations, babies arriving feet or buttocks first rather than head first, were among the most dangerous, specific complications. The trochlea and other medieval medical texts describe techniques for managing them, ways of repositioning the mother, ways of reaching inside to manually guide the baby. These techniques required skill and experience, and, very often, a willingness to perform an intensely invasive physical maneuver without any of the tools or preparations that modern medicine would consider essential. When they worked, they were extraordinary demonstrations of practical knowledge. When they did not, both mother and child were in immediate danger. The medieval woman going into labor was not simply thinking about medical outcomes. She was thinking about her soul, and the soul of the child she was bringing into the world. Religion was not separate from the physical experience of childbirth in the medieval world. It was woven through it at every level. When labor began in earnest, prayer intensified. The women in the room would pray, often aloud, invoking specific saints and asking for specific forms of protection. The saint who occupied the center of this devotional universe was Margaret of Antioch, a 3rd century martyr whose legend described her being swallowed whole by a dragon and emerging unharmed because of the crucifix she carried. The symbolism was transparent and powerful. Just as Margaret had been delivered from the body of the dragon, so the laboring woman hoped to be delivered of the child within her own body. By the 13th century, more than 250 churches in France alone were dedicated to Margaret, and her cult had spread across the entire Christian world. Women carried small manuscript accounts of her life throughout their pregnancies, some of them written on long strips of parchment, specifically designed to be wrapped around the abdomen during labor, because contact with the text itself was understood to convey protection. A 15th century physician, Anthonius Guinarius of Pavia, recorded the following advice for practitioners attending a difficult birth. At the time of birth, it is good that the legend of Blessed Margaret be read, that she have relics of the saints on her, and that you carry out briefly some familiar ceremonies in order to please your patient and the old women. He said this not with contempt, but with pragmatic acknowledgement that these practices worked on the level of comfort and psychological support, and that a patient who felt supported and held within a familiar framework of meaning was a patient more likely to endure what was coming. Birthing girdles, long strips of parchment or fabric inscribed with prayers, images of Christ's passion, and invocations to Margaret and other saints, were pressed against the laboring woman's body. Holy relics, if they could be obtained, were placed nearby. Pieces of amber were pressed into the mother's hands, believed to have protective and pain-relieving properties. Prayer rolls were read aloud continuously, their words filling the warm, smoky air of the birthing room with the names of God and the saints, with petitions and promises and declarations of faith. If a woman had access to particularly powerful relics, a piece of cloth touched to a saint's bones, a small container of earth from the Holy Land, these would be present with her now. We might be tempted to see all of this as simply superstition, as the helpless gesture of people who had nothing real to offer, but that would be a mistake and a failure of imagination. The medieval world did not draw the sharp line between the spiritual and the physical that we draw today. In their understanding, the saints were genuinely present when called upon. Margaret had genuinely survived the belly of the dragon, and her protection was genuinely available to women laboring through their own kinds of impossible passage. To pray was to act. To hold a blessed object was to be connected to something larger than the terror of the room. And across many years of research into the psychology of pain and of difficult medical experiences, we know that the quality of meaning a person brings to suffering, the degree to which they feel held within a larger framework, connected to something beyond the immediate moment, genuinely affects how that suffering is experienced. The prayers and the relics were not nothing. They were doing real work, even if not the work their practitioners believed they were doing. But sometimes, prayer was not enough. Sometimes the labor did not progress, and the baby did not come, and the hours accumulated and the mother's strength began to fail. And the midwife had exhausted her store of techniques and remedies, and now faced a situation that went beyond the limits of what she had been trained to handle. In these moments, the room would shift. The atmosphere that had been warm and purposeful would acquire a different quality, a tightening, a barely acknowledged fear. The midwife would confer with the other women. Perhaps a physician would be sent for, if one was available. If the family could afford it, if the distance could be covered in time, perhaps the priest would be sent for as well. Because if the baby was going to be born now, or if the mother was not going to survive, the spiritual preparations needed to be made. In the most desperate situations, the midwife would attempt a manual delivery, reaching in to reposition the baby, to guide it through the birth canal by force and skill and experience. This was painful beyond description for the laboring woman, and required extraordinary physical courage from the midwife. It sometimes worked. It sometimes resulted in injuries to the mother that would heal over weeks or months, leaving her altered but alive. And sometimes it did not work at all. When a mother died in labor with the child still undelivered, the church had a very specific instruction for what should happen next. The practice was called sectio in mortua, a section performed on the dead, and it meant cutting open the body of the deceased mother to extract the living child before it too died, so that it could be baptized and its soul saved. The Church Council of Cologne mandated this practice in 1280, and earlier church councils in the 13th century had already described it as an obligation. The legal tradition behind it went back to ancient Roman law, which forbade the burial of a pregnant woman before the child was extracted. This was not a surgical procedure in the modern sense. It was an act of desperate faith and spiritual urgency, performed with whatever blade was available, by whoever was present, not a surgeon typically, but a barber, or a midwife, or a priest. The goal was not to save the mother. She was already beyond saving. The goal was to give the child a chance, however small, at both physical life and the eternal life that baptism would secure. Historical documents record 13 known cases of this practice occurring in France, Italy, and Sweden from the 13th century onwards. But these are only the cases that were formally documented. The practice was almost certainly more widespread. The first well-documented case of a mother surviving a cesarean section during her lifetime was not until 1610. And even then, the mother survived for only 25 days, and the child for only 9. Before antiseptics, before anesthesia, before the ability to stitch the uterus closed and manage the resulting hemorrhage, the operation was unsurvivable. It was an act of the heart, not of medicine. When a child was born alive, when the labor reached its end, and the long, extraordinary passage of a new person into the world was complete, the room changed once more, and this time, the change was relief. The baby was received by the midwife into waiting hands, cleaned of the fluids of birth, and assessed quickly. If the child appeared weak or struggling, the midwife might baptize it immediately, because the medieval church was clear that an unbaptized infant who died was in a state of spiritual peril, unable to enter heaven, consigned to a place of neither joy nor suffering, called limbo, a theologically contested but widely feared destination. The midwife had been instructed in the proper formula for emergency baptism. She had been required, in the oath she swore when she began her practice, to know these words and to use them if necessary without waiting for a priest. She carried water for this purpose with her always. If the baby appeared healthy and strong, the baptism would wait the short time until the father and the godparents could take the child to the church. This ceremony was conducted quickly, not days later, as baptism sometimes is now, but within hours or at most a day or two, because everyone involved understood what a newborn life was worth in a world without antibiotics, without the ability to manage the dozens of infections and complications that could carry an infant away in a matter of days. The swaddling came first. The newborn was washed carefully in warm water, then wrapped in long strips of cloth that bound its limbs tightly against its body. This practice, which strikes us now as potentially restrictive, was based on the medieval understanding that newborn infants were so warm and moist in their humoral state, so newly emerged from the internal heat of the womb, that their limbs might be deformed by their own excessive softness if they were not supported and constrained while they firmed up. The swaddling was not a cruelty, it was a form of care. The father, waiting outside the room where his wife had labored for hours, or perhaps days, was brought in to see his child only after it had been cleaned and wrapped. The presentation of the newborn to the father was a ritual moment with its own social weight, one of the hinges on which the household's future would turn. And then, the baptism, the first great public act of the new child's life, conducted in the church with the godparents making promises on the infant's behalf, the priest pouring water and saying the ancient words, the chrism cloth that would be kept afterward as a record of this moment, used at the mother's churching ceremony weeks later as a visible link between the two rituals that framed the birth. Infant mortality in the medieval world was staggeringly high by any modern standard. From parish records and early modern estimates, historians have reconstructed that somewhere in the range of 140 out of every 1,000 live births in pre-modern England resulted in infant deaths before the first birthday. Some estimates suggest that as many as 30% of all children born did not survive to their 15th year. The causes were what you would expect: infection, above all, dysentery, respiratory infections, smallpox, measles, Diseases that modern medicine manages with vaccines and antibiotics in support of hospital care. And that, in the medieval world, could carry a healthy infant away in days. Malnutrition played a role when harvests failed, or when a mother's milk was inadequate, because there was no formula, no alternative to breast milk, except the services of a wet nurse if the family was prosperous enough to afford one. The grief that medieval parents felt at the loss of an infant was real and deep, even if it was expressed differently than it might be today. There is a long historiographical argument about whether medieval parents were somehow more detached from their infants, more resigned to loss before it came, than modern parents. And the consensus among historians who have studied the actual evidence has come down firmly against this idea. The documents that survive, letters, diaries, chronicles, saints' lives, are full of accounts of parents devastated by the deaths of their children. A parent who had lost 5 children out of 8 born was not numb to the deaths. They were marked by them, carrying the weight of 5 names alongside the 3 who survived. The frequency of loss did not make it easier. It simply made it familiar. The mother who had survived childbirth began a period of recovery governed by religious ritual as much as by physical need. The lying-in period, the time of confinement that followed the birth, typically lasted around 40 days, a number with deep religious resonance, echoing the 40 days of Christ's fasting in the wilderness and the 40-day period of purification prescribed for women after childbirth in the book of Leviticus. During this time, the new mother was expected to rest, to be attended to eat the strengthening foods her body needed, broth and wine and eggs and warming grains. She was not to venture out of her chamber. She was not to be seen in public. This was the ideal, at least, for women of the upper and middle classes, whose households could manage without them for 6 weeks. For the majority of women, the wives of peasant farmers, of craftsmen, of the laboring poor, reality was considerably different. A woman whose hands were needed in the fields or the workshop or the kitchen might not have the luxury of 40 days of rest, might be back at work within days of giving birth, her body still raw and exhausted, her child nursing at intervals. For these women, the recommendation of rest was aspirational rather than achievable. Their strength was, in a real sense, the resource on which the household depended, and the household could not always afford to wait while it recovered. At the end of the lying-in period came churching, the ceremony in which the new mother was formally received back into the community and the public life of the church. She walked to the church in a ritual procession, bringing with her the chrism cloth from her child's baptism, and she knelt before the altar while the priest blessed her and gave thanks for her survival and her child's. The theological interpretation of this ceremony was contested in the medieval period. Was it a purification, suggesting that childbirth had rendered her somehow unclean? Or was it simply a thanksgiving, a public acknowledgement that she had passed through danger and emerged? Scholars debate this still, but its social function was clear. It marked the end of the liminal period, the return of the woman to her place in the community, the formal acknowledgement that the crisis was over and ordinary life had resumed. An ordinary life, for the medieval woman, meant the possibility of another pregnancy. Women of the medieval period typically bore many children over the course of their fertile years, not necessarily because they wanted many children in the abstract, but because contraception was unreliable, and because the expectation of frequent pregnancy was simply part of the fabric of married life. The average medieval mother might experience 7 or 8 pregnancies, each one carrying its own measure of risk and hope, each one bringing the midwife back to the door and the prayers back to the air of the warm, sealed room. What this meant, cumulatively, was that childbearing occupied a large portion of a medieval woman's adult life. There were years of pregnancy, years of nursing, years of recovering from one birth and preparing, whether consciously or not, for the next. The social identity of the medieval woman was deeply bound up with motherhood, not because women were reduced to it, exactly, but because reproduction was central to the functioning of families, households, and communities in a way that it is not required to be in a world with effective contraception and infant formula and smaller, economically self-contained family units. The relationship between medieval mothers and their children has sometimes been misrepresented in popular history as one of deliberate emotional distance, as if the high rate of infant mortality somehow induced medieval parents to withhold love until a child had proven its capacity to survive. This is not what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows, instead, is something more complex and more human. Parents who loved their children fully and were devastated by their deaths, who marked those deaths in religious observance and in the naming of subsequent children after those who had been lost, who carried grief in quiet and persistent ways. The fact that loss was common did not make it easier. It made it a different kind of burden, not a shock, exactly, but a weight that sat permanently in the background of parental love, an awareness that the child in your arms might not be in them tomorrow. That shaped how you held them, but did not diminish the holding. Medieval women were not simply passive in the face of this reality. They exercised considerable agency within the birthing room. The community of women who attended a birth was not simply passive witness, but active participant, making decisions, applying knowledge, supporting one another through crisis. The midwife was an expert in a genuinely demanding field, and her expertise was recognized and valued. The medical texts produced by women, the Trotula, the works of Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote with clinical precision about women's medicine in the 12th century, represent a body of knowledge that was real and in some respects more effective than the officially sanctioned medicine of learned university physicians who had no clinical experience of childbirth whatsoever. Hildegard of Bingen deserves a particular moment of attention because she is one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of medicine, and her work bears directly on everything we have been discussing. A 12th century abbess and polymath, she produced two major medical works, Physica and Causae et Curae, that described hundreds of plants, animals, and minerals and their medical uses with a precision and specificity that places her among the serious natural philosophers of her era, not among folk practitioners. Her descriptions of women's conditions, of the relationship between the uterus and the whole body's health, of the herbal treatments that supported childbirth and recovery. These are works of careful observation, written by a woman who was thinking rigorously about the body in the intellectual language available to her time. She recommended specific preparations for specific purposes, recorded what she had observed to work and what she had observed to fail, and organized her knowledge into a framework that could be taught and transmitted. The Trotula itself, that compendium of women's medicine from Salerno, describes, among other things, how to repair the physical injuries that childbirth could cause. The text was written or compiled by practitioners who understood the anatomy of the female body with a clinical directness that is still striking to read. Instructions for postpartum care, for managing difficult labors, for addressing the retained placenta, for supporting the mother's recovery. These are practical medical texts, not prayers in the guise of science. They represent a genuine tradition of women's medicine that existed in parallel to, and sometimes in tension with, the male-dominated learned medicine of the universities. Here is the thing that popular history sometimes gets wrong about medieval childbirth, and that is worth correcting before we close. It was not simply barbaric. It was not simply a catalog of ignorance and unnecessary suffering. The women who attended births in the medieval world knew what they were doing, within the limits of what could be known. Their herbal pharmacopoeia contained genuine medicines, plants whose active compounds we have since isolated and synthesized, whose effectiveness we have demonstrated in clinical trials, whose mechanisms we have explained in the language of modern biochemistry. The midwife who administered raspberry leaf tea to a laboring woman was doing something that had been observed to work over generations of practice, even if she could not explain why it worked. The midwife who manually turned a breech baby was performing a skilled procedure that required years of training, that saved lives when it was done correctly. The garlic and leek eye salve, preserved in a 10th century English manuscript, was recently tested by researchers at the University of Nottingham against MRSA, the antibiotic-resistant bacterial strain that threatens modern hospitals, and found to be 90% effective. The medieval healers who recorded that recipe did not know what MRSA was. They did not know what bacteria were. They knew that the salve worked because they had seen it work, and they wrote it down so that others could use it. This is not so different from what science does at its most fundamental level. Observe, record, transmit. What medieval medicine lacked was not goodwill or intelligence or genuine knowledge of the body. What it lacked was germ theory. That one shift in understanding that would make it possible to know why infections occurred and how to prevent them. That would eventually make childbed fever a preventable and treatable condition rather than a sentence. Without that knowledge, the midwife and the physician were working from an incomplete map. They were skilled navigators who could not see the reefs beneath the surface of the water. And so, we come to the close of the night we began in. The fire is burned lower, and the room is quieter now. The long hours of labor have ended. The baby, small, astonishingly alive, perfect in the way that newborns are perfect even in their strangeness, has been cleaned and swaddled and placed in its mother's arms. The midwife is cleaning her instruments and packing her bundle. The other women in the room are breathing out, the held tension of the night releasing slowly into something that feels, in this moment, like peace. The mother holds her child and looks at its face. She has just passed through one of the most dangerous experiences a human body can survive, and she knows it in the particular quiet way that you know something you have been living with for months. She did not go through it alone. She went through it in the company of women who knew what they were doing, who carried knowledge accumulated across generations in their hands and their memory, who prayed alongside her and held her, and did not leave. The prayers and the herbs and the care and the presence of every woman in the room, these were not nothing. They were, in the fullest sense of the word, medicine. For medieval women, childbirth was not simply a medical event. It was a moment balanced between life and death, between the physical and the spiritual, between the knowledge of the hands and the reach of the heart towards something beyond understanding. It was dangerous, and it was attended with fear, and it was surrounded by a community of women who made it as survivable as their world allowed it to be. And every new child meant hope, a small, breathing, impossibly fragile piece of the future, held in arms that had earned the right to hold it. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, where plague and famine and war and the simple, indifferent cruelty of biology could take anyone at any time, a child born alive and healthy was not taken for granted. It was a miracle in the word's most literal sense, something to wonder at, something to give thanks for, something around which the whole complicated machinery of medieval life organized itself with purpose and meaning and love. The midwife steps outside into the cold air of the early morning, and the stars are still out. In the house behind her, a child has come into the world. She has done this many times, and she will do it many times more. She walks home through the dark, carrying her knowledge in her hands, as she always does, as the women before her always did. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you for spending this time here. History is most alive when we let ourselves feel how real it was, when we sit with the people who lived it and try, however imperfectly, to understand what they faced. If this kind of calm, careful storytelling is something you want more of, a like and a subscribe help more than you might think. And wherever you found this video, whether a friend mentioned it or an algorithm delivered it, or you fell into it from somewhere unexpected, let us know in the comments. We'd love to know how you got here. Rest well.